And now we're back with our panel. Gwen Ifill is the co-anchor and the managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. Michael Gerson is a columnist for the Washington Post. And we welcome to the broadcast radio talk show host Hugh Hewitt, who is also the author of The Queen, The Epic Ambition of Hillary, and the Coming of a Second Clinton Era, and David Ignatius, also a Washington Post columnist. David, I want to start with you. Yemen, the killing of al-Qaeda's #2, how important was that?
Well, it was a significant strike. I was struck listening to Chairman Nunes about the deteriorating situation in Yemen. The U.S. has very few weapons now, other than these drone attacks, which are so controversial. Second thing that was really striking in what he said is that we are at the highest domestic threat level, if I understood him, in our recent history, even higher than after 9/11. You couldn't hear that and not wonder at all of things that he knows that are coming at us or are on the radar that could cause trouble.
President Obama once pointed to Yemen as a kind of symbol of how things could go well. That was not too long ago. Why have things shifted so badly?
John, Yemen tragically is a place where the U.S. did try to do it right. We had a strong embassy team. The embassy reached out to the different groups that tried to sponsor dialogue. U.S. military tried to train Yemeni soldiers to fight this fight themselves, and it all crumpled. I mean, the best efforts the U.S. has made, I think, in any of these Middle Eastern countries came to naught. Now we have no embassy there. We have very few weapons. It just shows that these are countries that are coming apart, and we don't have the tools to put them back together.
Let's pivot and switch to Charleston now and talk about that. Hugh, what do you make of what happened? President Obama says that it's guns. How do you pick apart what happened in Charleston?
I start with the 9 saints who were assassinated. I was at Mass this morning at the Cathedral of St. Matthew's down the street, and the pastor preached on these people. They were studying the Gospel of Mark, the 4th chapter, the parable of the sowers, and they've already brought back 30, 60, 100-fold in grace and forgiveness. The example of their families was amazing. But the reading today was about the sea being in the middle of a storm and the apostles being afraid. And so people are afraid after this, and rightly so, of Yemen, of domestic terrorists, and they have to be calm, and they have to reflect upon the fact that there are many good people in Charleston sitting around small groups praying for souls like that tormented killer. And I think that's the good part of this. I'm not sure we should go to political solutions yet. I thought Senator Scott was right in that.
Gwen, you also went to church this morning.
I did, and he preached from exactly the same scripture. And the question that my pastor raised at Metropolitan AME Church, where we feel very closely affected by this, many people, including my pastor, knew Reverend Pinckney and had connections in South Carolina. So there was a lot of emotion there, and there was a vigil there on Friday. But he preached that same sermon, but he said that he pointed out how the disciples had questions. Who is this person who's appeared and has calmed the seas? And that's what we need to have. And that before we race to answers, that we have to have questions. And that forgiveness itself is a wonderful thing, but it's a process. It's something that you strive toward. It's something you have ambition toward. It was amazing to hear those souls talk about that on Friday, but you also knew that they weren't all the way there yet. They couldn't be. But that doesn't mean that we stop there. And that's where it's never too soon to start talking about solutions, because we have, as Senator Scott was talking about, robust conversations all the time, and then they fade away and nothing else happens.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in that robust conversation once it starts. Michael Gerson, forgiveness is something we don't see usually in politics in this kind of way.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there's something impossible at the heart of the Christian faith, which is love your enemies. It's something that I don't know I could do. And when you see it evidenced, it has a tremendous power. This forgiveness comes from a position of strength, spiritual maturity, institutional strength. This is not a weak virtue. It comes from the strength to love. That's what Martin Luther King talked about. We often preached on the strength to love. And I think that's what we've seen demonstrated in this circumstance.
Hugh, I want to ask you about the debate that's risen up. We're going to switch to the solutions portion here about the flag in Charleston. What do you think will happen?
Well, if I were a state senator or a state legislator in South Carolina, I would vote to remove the memorial. I happen to have been in Colombia with my wife at the state capitol when the first debate was raging. And I was walking up the steps and I was stopped by the lieutenant governor, and he wanted me to, he said, please understand, that's not our state. And the flag came up in the 2014 gubernatorial debate, and Nikki Haley said it never comes up when CEOs move to South Carolina. I think it will be gone. It will be gone very quickly. But I do respect people like Senator Walker, Senator Scott and Governor Walker, who don't want to throw themselves into the political thing without focusing on, you know, I didn't know Pastor Pinckney, but I have worshiped with Cecil Murray, a great AME pastor in Los Angeles, and Mark Whitlock, a great AME pastor in Orange County. And I just want to grieve those people for a while, because I just think that to bring up the flag and to rush to this, although it has to be done in a few weeks, ignores these extraordinary, Mrs. Hurd, she's really one of the most extraordinary people I've read about. Ferocious shoe warrior, one of her friends called her. Librarian. I mean, they're all just wonderful people, and I don't like the debate going there that quickly.
I think that it goes there that quickly because the natural human instinct is, what do you do? How do you stop this? And so we look for symbols. And the flag is a good and enduring and recurring symbol. So when Mitt Romney said yesterday the flag should come down, he had said that before. When Hillary Clinton said the flag should come down, she had said that before. But then she took it beyond the symbol and started talking about race and the conversation that we should be having in this country about race. So we can get distracted and get right past talking about the victims. You're right. We can go to the symbol of the flag. But at some point, more than a robust conversation has to happen. The president's solution is guns, to speak to guns. Other people's solution is to speak to domestic terrorism, as we heard Congressman Nunez talk about. But someone wants to move, but the key to this is moving past the commiseration and onto some sort of action that speaks to the underlying problem.
We're going to get back to that underlying problem in a moment, talk about guns and some other things. We'll be right back in a moment with more from our panel. To you. And we're back with our panel, Michael Gerson, the causes of this. Where do you put your finger on it?
Well, America has at least here two problems. There's racism. These Americans are dead because they were African American. That's the simple fact of this matter. And we really need to question, how does that jump from generations, get to young people like this? That's a really important question in our society. And then we also have the problem of angry young men radicalized by the internet, which is broader than this circumstance. It's actually, when you combine those two problems, the racism and the angry young men, you get domestic terrorism. That's what you end up with. And in those cases, it's not a web of a conspiracy. It's actually the signs of radicalization in an individual somehow that we need to get at and become more conscious about.
David, the president said this doesn't happen in other advanced countries. What did you make of that and his?
I thought one of the really moving parts of this terrible story this past week was watching President Obama on Thursday morning, angry, deeply wounded himself. He looked older, tireder than I can remember, but he was speaking from the heart about this problem, and it struck me that in the remaining time that he's president, after Ferguson, after New York City, after Baltimore, after now Charleston, this issue of violence against African Americans and how we talk about it, how we begin to move to a different place, is the issue before the president. It's his chance to do something that he can uniquely do, and I hope that's still in him. He sounded so beaten down by the problem, but I hope it's still there.
It reminded me, John, I try to, though I don't agree with him on anything, pray for the safety of the president every day, because there are a lot of haters in this country that would like to harm him and his family, and I think this reminds us that because of race. But what Michael said about the internet, people forget about 8 years ago, an anti-Christian, not an anti-black extremist, attacked New Way and Youth with a Mission in Colorado, murdered 4 people over the course. He had been radicalized. He was a young man. Stanley McChrystal was in my studio last week, said 100 million times a day, ISIS touches someone with their message of radicalization. Angry young men in the internet make for, whether they are empowering racists, or they are empowering jihadists, or they are empowering anyone, it's a nightmarish problem that we haven't begun to cope with.
Gwen, the president mentioned guns, but as David suggested, he seemed exhausted by, and he then later said, no, I'm not defeated.
Yeah,
but,
the next day he came out and kind of tried to back away from that a little bit.
But what can the president do?
Well, in reality, we know that what the political reality is in Washington, which is there's not a lot of stomach for guns. In fact, I think we heard Senator Scott may have been the one who said, you know, there are no existing gun laws that would have stopped this from happening. But there was even pushback to the president's claim that this is the more violent, more gun-ridden nation than others, which caused the White House to send out a tweet in which they said that they're 279 times more likely to have we are 297 more times to have gun violence here than in Japan, 49 times more than France, 33 times more than Israel. We are a violent culture in many ways, and the question is, how does it manifest itself? And in this case, it's some people try to step around race, say it wasn't really about race, but then when we saw the manifesto, we saw it was.
I'd also add, though, that this is an opportunity for a Republican candidate to do a big picture speech, address issues of race and violence. I think that that's a missed opportunity to some extent. Republicans looked awkward in their initial reaction to this news, like they didn't know how to deal with it.
Jeb Bush did get it. He did come around to that.
He did, and a couple of them now have come out against the flag. But I think this is a case where a Republican could give a big picture speech and put some of this in context and have a real message.
Why was there awkwardness? Do you read it as awkwardness as well? And why was there?
I do, and it's because they don't. When facts are coming in, so often when I'm on the air, when there's breaking news, the story is not correct. If anyone had come forward and said anything on Wednesday night late, they would have been wrong. They would not have known about the manifesto. They would not have known it's a hardcore white racist domestic terrorist. We didn't know that until yesterday. And so I think candidates especially are tentative, but they need to be non-awkward now, and I think Michael is right. There's an opportunity here, and for Mrs. Clinton and Senator Sanders and Jim Webb, anyone who wants to lead this country has to talk about violence seriously.
Michael, you used to write speeches, and so if someone was going to give this big kind of a speech, they need an inroads a little bit, if you're a Republican, inroads into the other party to make their case. What would you say, if you were writing such a speech?
Well, I think it's a challenge, but I do think that there is a enduring problem that's transmitted between generations that has to be broken. The question is how we root this out in our laws and in our lives. And that, I think, is a question Republicans should have an answer to. How do we root out racism in our laws and in our lives? And then to go to talk about this additional problem of young men radicalized on the internet, which is a much broader challenge.
But first you have to acknowledge it. And the thing that struck me about the manifesto pictures yesterday was these were not selfies. Someone took those pictures. He's 21 years old. He didn't get radicalized yesterday. Somewhere in his life this happened. So it's not just one lone wacko. It's not just random violence. There is something underlying it which we have to speak to.
John, you know, as you think about how these pieces would be put together, as Michael says, one enduring part of this is going to be the faces of those parishioners who lost their loved ones. expressing forgiveness, and the persistence of the black church that they were part of. I mean, that church has been burned down, I think, twice over, and it came back. The story of Martin Luther King and these terrible church bombings. The church kept coming back and believed and had faith and didn't react violently. And if the country's going to build, there it is. That's what you build on.
All right, David, the last word. Thank you all very much.